Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Innovation Centre here on the Jurassic Park podcast. So today we have got a very special episode for you all. Obviously, it's Jurassic June, and it was recently the anniversary of Jurassic Park. So I am very, very excited to be joined by TyRuben Ellingson. TyRuben, why don't you say hello to everyone?
Hello. It's very nice to be joining you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. I know, obviously, we've been talking about it over email for a while, so really, really excited to get into it.
Yeah, I'm like I say, it's a perfect, nice sunny afternoon here in Richmond, Virginia, on the east coast of the United States. So a perfect day to talk some dinosaurs.
Yeah, remarkably, it is actually sunny here in the UK today as well. So clearly the weather gods have aligned for us.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I guess to kick off, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and kind of your experience with the film industry? Because I feel like there's a lot there to kind of dissect.
Yeah, there's actually more hours than there's actually more hours of conversation than we could put into today.
Yeah.
But I think in a nutshell, like the things that I like to share about my particular journey, and this maybe stems a little bit from being an educator. I really like to share with my students the idea that they can succeed at whatever goals they set, because at the end of the day, that's my story. So I was born and raised in a small town in northern Minnesota, which is right up at the top of the United States, right next to Canada. I lived there and, worked in my father's art studio. My father was a university professor, so I could draw and paint and make things in his space. And I really had a really happy family life, and didn't really think about leaving home until I was in my early 20s. By that particular juncture, I had a really high level of interest in film, but there wasn't any film program at the school I attended.
Yeah.
So I was trying to just kind of cobble a career path together. It took me an additional probably 7 or 8 years and a lot of other stories, but eventually I was able to interview at Industrial Light and Magic, which would have been in probably 1989, and
Okay, cool.
from that interview, I was able to get an opportunity to be come in and try, like a first shot at working there, and so I ended up in the ILM art department, and once I arrived there, I committed myself to being the most focused and the hardest working person in the company, which is a pretty tall order because it's a pretty extraordinary team of people. But I think the good fortune is that I was in my early 30s. I had a supportive lifestyle, and I just really focused in on, learning about the craft of working in the film business, especially at that time in visual effects. And so each of those steps has another narrative that goes along with it. But the bottom line is I just made it by cold calling people and never giving up. And then, that's how I did it.
I think that's the thing a lot of people say, and especially when I was coming up through college as well, studying media, that 9 times out of 10, when you go into the film industry, a lot of people will say no, and it's just knowing how to pick yourself back up and then continue knock on the next door until eventually you get in somewhere. So yeah, no, I think that's cool. So obviously you mentioned that you work in the art department on films, and that's something that you still do currently as well. So I'm quite interested because I spoke to Andy Nicholson, I think it was a couple of years back at this point, who was the set designer on Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. So I always find it interesting to kind of think about how do you start with a concept for something. Where does that concept come from? And then how do you kind of develop upon that over time? What sort of things do you consider?
Well, so at the time that Jurassic was being made, I was actually, as an employee of Industrial Light and Magic, which obviously was a facility that had lots of different departments and areas of expertise. The art department, which at that time I think there were like maybe 9 full-time art directors, or maybe 7.
Yeah.
There were always a couple of extra people that did specialized things in the art department, but there was probably 6 or 7 of us that were really, focusing in on visual effects, art direction, and of course some of them have gone on to be, very recognized. Harley Jessup was one of the VFX art directors who went on to work at Pixar. He's still at Pixar. John Bell, who actually went down to work on Jurassic with Rick Carter as part of the core design team. He was actually at ILM when I arrived. Mark Moore, who did movies, just his credit list is hugely long. And then Doug Chang, who, of course, from the Star Wars universe. So there was 6 of us. And what we basically did was we would kind of build relationships inside the company, and we would try to, in a friendly way, compete for various shows. Sometimes you'd be busy working on a show and a new show would come in, so there wasn't any chance that you could work on it. But oftentimes 1 or 2 of us would be, between shows, and then you'd go like, oh, I really want to work on this. And so you'd have to do your own sort of engagement, to try to, say, hey, I'm here, I'm ready to go. But the way that it is in visual effects is you have a certain kind of creative thing that you supply, and then you have more of what I would call a facility piece. So work that has to get done to just help the larger visual effects machine move forward and produce good work on a schedule. So in that particular arena, it would be doing things like storyboarding, where you're actually, producing storyboards that help communicate ideas to the larger team. On the other end of the spectrum, on the creative end, you might be asked to do something, completely original. On Jurassic, I would say that the bulk of my work was more about the facilitation of the process, because so much of the design work was nature. I mean, we looked at nature for all of the cues as far as how the dinosaurs looked, and we had paleontologists and the Tippett guys were involved, and so there was this, kind of shared collective awareness of what would these dinosaurs look like, how they would behave. And then, of course, at the Winston Studios, they were doing these very, very elaborate, very beautifully executed hero models that drove a lot of the visual effects. So other than, doing some kind of conceptual designs for scenes, like when the Jeep is, after the T-Rex attacks on the road and the Jeep is pushed over the embankment, I worked with Dennis Muren to try to come up with a look of how that Jeep falling would work with the live action components. So in a weird way, I was conceptualizing or visualizing something that was still in pieces. With the dinosaurs, I did some studies of the skin patterns and those kinds of things. But the majority of it was actually going to production meetings on a daily basis, going to the screenings, making, adding to the critique of shots, and then always keeping an eye on the storyboards and making sure that the storyboards were up to date and accurate, and those kind of move along through the process as the film goes from, its entry into the facility till the final shots are going out. I know that's a little cryptic, but the art department, if you think about it, was a service kind of a task and then a creative task. And depending on any show, you kind of go back and forth between those two opportunities, depending on the needs.
I think it's cool because a lot of people, and I mean, I know I'm especially guilty of it as well, will instantly think, oh, cool, those are the guys who designed the dinosaurs. And you completely forget that actually there is that whole process that needs to go in before that to establish how things are going to unfold in the film. And I mean, storyboards just in themselves are so important in then allowing the rest of the film to actually happen. So it's really cool to kind of hear a little bit more about that, because I think it's always something that people undervalue when it comes to film production. Cool, so obviously I would love to talk more about Jurassic. But before we dive into that, I kind of did want to ask, do you have any other projects that you've worked on that have been particularly memorable? Purely because I was looking at your IMDb ahead of this and I recognised quite a few, and it was cool to see it. You have worked on one of my favourite films, which is Battle Los Angeles, because I thought that was really well done. So I'm interested as to which ones have been your favourites to work on.
You know, it's so funny. I mean, it's one of those cosmically ironic moments because I just hung up the phone with Jonathan Liebsman, the director of Battle Los Angeles, in order to get ready to speak to you. So
yeah.
I'll be sure to. I'll be speaking with him later today. I'll definitely to tell him that you're a fan of the picture. Well, one of the reasons. So when I was at ILM, I was there for 5 years, and my experiences were fantastic, and I really had I came at a very important moment in time because we were moving from the traditional visual effects pipeline, which was primarily models and miniatures and motion control photography that had created the movies that were so impactful on me when I was young, you know, the Star Wars films, Indiana Jones, and so forth. And we were really starting to do CGI or computer graphics. And I was fortunate enough to actually work on both sides of that fence or bubble. And for me to say, well, it was extraordinary is, it's an understatement. But in that time frame, as much as I appreciated those opportunities, I really was trying to become a designer. I wanted to create work. And I mean, I wanted to create original designs that would end up on screen and help tell the story that the director was interested in. And while I was at ILM, I did several shows that gave me more of an opportunity to do that than Jurassic Park did. One of them was the Flintstones, where I was the live action version. And so I actually did design like Dino's body. I designed Bedrock. I did, some of the creatures, some of the kind of dinosaurs that appear as ancillary. I really loved that. And then eventually I did the special edition of Star Wars with George, and then I designed new robots and the big heavy landers for the Imperial, for the stormtroopers. And it just gave me more, I think, interest in becoming a full-time designer and not having to do as much to facilitate the visual effects. So I met Guillermo del Toro at around my 5th year at the company, and he asked me to come work on his movie Mimic. And then, of course, that led to me working with him on most of his films, the Blade movie, the Hellboy films, Pacific Rim. And through that period, I started to meet more directors, meet other production personnel. And it was actually, as far as Battle LA goes, it was an acquaintance of mine who I had known at ILM, Stefan Deckent, who had worked with Jonathan. And he introduced us and said, hey, this is a director that you might want to, he's doing this cool, film, you should try to connect with him. And so we talked. And then, of course, there was Avatar, and I did all the vehicle design. And, of course, I met Jim while I was at ILM. I actually worked with him on a television commercial, but it was many years. I kept in contact with him, then eventually was called in to work on Battle Angel Alita that just came out with Robert Rodriguez. But I was working on it with when Jim was planning to direct it. And then not that long after that, we got started on Avatar. And of course, that was about almost 3 years of work I did on that. Yeah. And that was, all the vehicles and the big robot amp suit. And there were 5 of us on Avatar who worked on Jurassic. So, it's a small club. Steven Rosenbaum, Joe Letteri, Rick Carter, and myself. And then I think there was one other person, but it was kind of weird because inside of Avatar was a weird Jurassic club. Yeah. So I when I'm asked about like my, what's your favorite film? What was your favorite experience? Every movie that you're working on, it consumes your creativity in such a way and your imagination that in those days that you're working on it, it's like the greatest. It's really
Yeah.
and then when they finish, they're so different that I don't. It's hard for me to even put them in the same basket, because like Mimic is a monster movie, a creature movie. Hellboy is kind of a Beauty and the Beast story,
Yeah.
and then Avatar is like this incredible adventure film. So even though you can say they're kind of like FX heavy, maybe, fantasy, science fiction, narrative films, to me, they each one has a particular, slot in the kind of larger encyclopedia of films. So I don't know. I've been really, really fortunate. But I would say that, because again, I suppose somebody's going to listen to this and go, well, being fortunate only gets you so far. I was very
Yeah.
actively promoting myself through that whole period, and I was always very quick to make introductions, meet people, share my work. And so it's always, as much as you have to focus on the now, you have to prepare for what's yet to come. So building your skills, your network, always evolving as a thinker, as a creative, as a problem solver. All these things come into play. I know that I was always growing as a designer, and I know that I was. I know that it's not like you ever plateau. You have always got to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think I kind of see that a lot with photography. I find that I'll look at a photo I took a year ago and kind of see things that I would have done differently. And I feel like that just shows that, you're always progressing and always moving forwards. And I'm glad we got to touch on Avatar a little bit, because obviously, as you can tell, I am one of the younger people here at the podcast. So Avatar was one of the big films for me as I was growing up, and I always loved the design of the RDA vehicles. So it's really cool to hear it. You got to work on a lot of those. So going from very, very futuristic kind of designs back to Jurassic, obviously something that is well documented with Jurassic is the fact that there was very much at one point going to be stop motion used for all of the dinosaurs, and obviously that was what Tippett Studios in particular were looking at. So what was it kind of like being a part of that kind of, I suppose, I'm trying to think of that kind of like linchpin moment in film where we suddenly went from one style of animation to obviously CGI coming in, and what were some of the challenges that brought? Because it was all very new, like in terms of technology at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's. I know these stories, like a lot of stories, of course, because I'm asked about Jurassic and I follow, things that are written about it. There's a lot of narratives that, have been discussed and keep coming back up. And, the kind of shift from stop motion, which was actually going to be actually Phil was going to be using Go Motion, which was a technology that he devised and had used on Dragon Slayer, which was the use of servos or very precise actuators to move the stop motion puppet just slightly while the camera was filming it, and that created a little bit of a motion blur, and it made for a more fluid kind of animation as opposed to just the kind of what we recognize as a more Harryhausen kind of each frame is basically each frame that you're shooting is perfectly in focus, and you're not getting any motion blur that you would normally get from a shutter in film. So there were going to be techniques like that used. And I know that originally the thought was to possibly use computer graphics. It wouldn't even really have been computer graphics in the way we think about it now, but it would basically be using a digital approach to blurring the dinosaurs that would have been captured in stop motion. So to create this kind of motion blur artificially in post-production. But there was, breakthroughs or advancements being made all the time at that time. Like, I just did a Zoom meeting 2 weeks ago with Steve Williams and Mark DePay and Wes Takahashi, who at that time ran the what we used to call visual effects animation department. And it really was a handful of people in what was this very tiny computer graphics group, and spearheaded most definitely by Mark DePay and Steve Williams, who conceived of this very famous walking skeleton test. And that was literally a dinosaur, a T-Rex skeleton that was walking. And it was interesting because the motion was very fluid, but it also had the attributes of looking as though it had been shot on film. So it had this kind of motion blur quality. It looked very smooth, and it felt very large because of the camera placement and so forth. And that was the thing that really started to catch the attention of the production team in Los Angeles, and eventually kind of led to the approval of another test that was the skinned version of the T-Rex. And that I actually, I could send it to you. I've had it online, but that I actually was asked to do a storyboard for that test, which really represents the first storyboard done on Jurassic Park at ILM. But they were already doing a larger storyboarding effort down in Los Angeles. But the things I can remember that I think are of interest was that even though there was this moment where it became visible to the decision makers that something profound was underway and that something profound was available to change the approach to creating this movie, everybody knew that it was also very risky. Everybody knew that there was a lot of unknowns, and I think it took a lot of time when I say a lot of time, I'm only talking weeks, but at the time, back in those days, it felt like we were in this kind of period of gestation. And even then, it felt as though there was always these possibilities that you'd have to start cutting corners and making other things work because you didn't want to put all your eggs in that one basket because of the unknowns. But it was heady. I mean, it's really hard to describe, especially to students in my classroom who, weren't even born then when Jurassic was made. I mean, it did feel like a renaissance. Every day when you went into work, you'd see something that you couldn't, even though you worked on it, you couldn't believe you were seeing it. And it was also a moment in time where there was a collective, I would call it like a resonance, like literally a feeling in the air that these changes were going to change more than this movie. Like they felt profound. And what I loved about it myself was that, like I mentioned earlier about coming in and wanting to be the hardest working person, everybody there was in that mindset. So on 24 hours of a day, there were people in the building working on Jurassic Park, and many of us would sleep at the building, sleep at ILM, and there was always new things to see, new problems to solve, and then there was this mind-boggling results that would come out of it, and then you would literally, like the old adage, like you'd have to pinch yourself, you'd have to say. And I remember one day when we saw some actual shots that had been output to film, and I think they were the main road sequence with rain effects and everything. When we see the wrecks, there was no sound effects yet, so it was just the wrecks like coming out, breaking the fence, walking on the road. And I remember going afterwards to a little coffee room and talking to Des Mirren, and I said, "Bruh, this movie is going to blow everyone's mind. Like literally no one will be able to understand what happened, and it's going to be hugely successful." And everybody was like, "Yeah." But nobody would say like, "Well, we'll wait and see." Everybody was like, yeah, it's really going to do that.
No, that's good to hear. It's nice to hear it. There was that kind of feeling with it. And I mean, obviously, when you look at it now, from the perspective of an outsider looking in, it really is one of those industry-defining moments. It has changed kind of what is possible in film and what can be achieved with visual effects. So I know that you mentioned that you were involved a lot in, obviously, the storyboarding and things like that. So I was interested, was the T-Rex breakout sequence deliberately planned to be done at nighttime as a part of that technology? Because I know a lot of people have perhaps suggested that was done to make it more immersive for audiences. So was that kind of part of the logic there as that was developing?
The main, okay, so the Crichton book came out, the Michael Crichton book, and if memory serves me, and I I'm sure this is easy to research, and I'm sure many that have studied the film more from like a broader perspective. I think that Steven got some kind of first look. Like I seem to recall that he had gotten the rights to it right away. And so there was this feeling like, oh, well, this movie is going to come. It's happening. And I think there was a lot of concern, if memory is that it felt like a movie that could go over budget really easy. I mean, it just felt like it. And so I think that Steven, and I remember there was a lot of concern that the budget couldn't get too huge. Like it was a nice sized budget, but everything was going to be controlled. They were going to try to make it super effectively. And one of the ways that you can do that, and Steven is, made by the time this movie started, he made lots of movies, right? One of the best ways you can control a film is to storyboard it. And so they set up a team at Amblin down in Los Angeles that right away was storyboarding the whole movie. So when they started doing the budgeting for the visual effects, and when those sequences started to get boarded out and approved by Steven, they would start to show up in Marin County where ILM was, and at Tippett Studios, and then those would be like viewed by the production team. And I have no recollection of the main road sequence ever being anything but at night. And then knowing the way Steven approaches storytelling, it would make sense that it would be at night. And I think that the use of rain, you could say, well, that would maybe help cover up mistakes, or maybe it was a way to like soften it, but actually it's way harder. Like everything is harder when you're using rain. Like live action is harder. Of course, it really affected the animatronics. It had an impact. It's harder on the crew. It's harder. I mean, it's just harder. So I'm pretty sure that it would have been something that was very consciously done to set a certain mood. And one of the things that, because you brought up that the rain and the dark night with the T-Rex road sequence, is that they had to write a special shader, a way to process the 3D geometry and create the effect of water on the T-Rex's skin.
Okay.
And that was an incredible accomplishment by the technical directors, the technical team, just to make that work. And when it started to work, at first it looked kind of more like static, like noise. But then it started to look more like water, and it started to almost have a sense like it was water rolling off. And what's weird is that no one really stops to notice that, but that placed the wreck so much more in the scene, and it really cemented it as a biological a biological event. That everything was, all the signals coming into your eyes were that you're in a real place. This is really how the world operates, and this is a real animal, and it's really raining on it. And so all your senses were telling you, no, this is real. My favorite shot in the entire film is actually one that there's nothing spectacular about it. It's when the T-Rex lowers its head and walks in front of the Jeep and crosses the headlights. And having grown up in northern Minnesota, I often would encounter deer and animals at night in the car. And there's always this sense that they're aware that you're there, but they don't really know how to process what you are. But it doesn't hold their attention very long, and the next thing you know, they're like, oh, this is weird, these light things, and then right away they're still looking at you like, I wonder what that is. And there's a moment with the Rex, and even if you look at that scene, there's a hang tag on the rearview mirror that's translucent, and we even composited the Rex to look like it's passing behind that semi-translucent plastic, and it's so. The animation is subtle. It's so real that in my mind, it's like a perfect shot. There's like 100% your senses are like, I'm done. I don't know where they got the dinosaur, but here it is. And I think that was most people's reactions, was they just were dumbfounded. Their brains were telling them one thing, and they had no solution. They had no explanation, right? In fact, when the movie first came out, you were like a baby if you were even born. When the movie first came out, everybody believed that the Stan Winston hydraulic Rex was used for the bulk of that sequence. I mean, most people thought, well, that must be the robot. That must be the robot. And it wasn't until like they saw, the Rex walking down the roadway. But even then, some people thought that might be the robot, because Stan had originally told Steven he could make a walking T-Rex.
Yeah.
So I think there was a long time before people really even understood, no, this is a computer. And then you got to remember that no one knew what computers really did, so it didn't help them.
Yeah. I think it's a real testament to how immersive it is, and obviously like going to that extra level is almost kind of like psychological in a way, because you've got to think, well, what is somebody going to process? What are the little details that they're going to be looking for, and how can we kind of make sure that they match up to what they're expecting? So obviously you mentioned that that's almost your perfect shot in a way, but I'm interested, are there any other moments that you remember working on where you particularly sat back and kind of thought, this is a cool sequence, I like what we've done with this?
Well, maybe you've read about it online. I think it's a couple places, but we were always trying to figure out how the animals would behave, you know, and so there was always this. The whole team was required to go to like mime classes.
Yeah.
So we did these kind of exercises to try to, get into the idea of like thinking like a dinosaur, as weird as that is, because dinosaurs probably, had minimal ability to think.
Yeah.
But we did like experiment around with like, well, maybe this would happen, maybe that would happen. And there was a test that we shot of Gallimimus all trying to run and jump over this log. And we shot it in the back lot of ILM. And I was never very athletic. I was an artist my whole life, so I spent my whole youth in the basement drawing and didn't play, baseball or basketball or any of those things. So I was as the art director, I had to work with the stage shop to build these big, like, tubes that represented the fallen tree. And they were big gutter tubes, like pipes that you put under a street. And then we set them up to imitate the fallen tree. And then we had cameras, and then everybody ran and jumped over. Well, when it got to my turn to jump over, because I'm such a ineffective athlete, I caught my foot and fell and broke my arm, which was my drawing arm.
Oh, wow.
And actually didn't get up because well, I actually did get up, but then right away I started getting, lightheaded and stuff and had to go to the emergency room. And then eventually I had to have surgery on my arm and was out of commission for a while. But Phil saw the footage, Phil Tippett, and then he said, well, if Ty fell, one of the Gallimimuses is going to fall. And from then on, they referred to that Gallimimus as Ty. And if you watch the sequence, you can see that all the Gallimimus, after they've, had their stampede, they're jumping over this log because the Rex is nearby, and then one of them falls down and gets right up and leaves. So I think that I was always a fan of that particular sequence for the reason that it was shot in daylight, like we talked about. Yeah. It had moving camera, which was super hard. It had issues of scale because the Gallimimuses tended to look like ostrich, but then you put them next to people and they looked really tall. And then they had a lot of them. I mean, there was like a dozen or maybe more in a shot, which is pretty amazing because that would have been in stop motion a nightmare. And then the scene has this dramatic leap, and then it ends with the Rex coming out and chomping one in a real full-on dinosaur chomp fest. So that sequence I like a great deal as well. And it means a lot to me because at least I broke my arm on a really killer sequence in Jurassic Park as opposed to, maybe a commercial I would have worked on for something,
Yeah, that galley is going to be your legacy now.
Exactly.
So it's cool, actually, we've moved on to that because the galley was one dinosaur that I made note of. Because obviously there were lots that... kind of the team had obviously got the Stan Winston maquettes and animatronics to use as reference, but as far as I'm aware, at least, there wasn't any of that for the galley, and obviously the Parasaurolophus as well. So how did you go about kind of designing those from the ground up when there wasn't any physical reference?
There was artwork done.
Okay, cool.
I remember seeing colored pencil studies of especially the Parasaurolophus. The galleys, I believe there was some concept artwork that had been done down in Los Angeles.
Okay, cool.
And we were probably making anything we did, like I did some of the Gallimimus spot patterns. And then I know we had one that was smaller, that was like a baby. And so we changed the design to be, we looked at like little deers and does and looked for patterns like what's the parent versus the babies typically are better camouflage, so we made him look a little more like the environment, but everything we did would be just sent down to Steven and put into the approval pipeline. It was always a team effort. Like believe it or not, it's so hard to do visual effects work, especially like at that level when it was so much innovation, that as much as you'd like to say, well, I designed the Parasaurolophus's, skin and stuff like that. On those assignments, everybody's like, what do we know? What reference do we have? Like, what's the best that we can get our hands on? Like, oh, there's a sketch, we'll take it. Even if it's somebody's, 1 hour study, like, well, yeah, bring it, like, send it to us. Because anytime you do have to do things from scratch, there's a different, it's a different kind of approval process. You have to first talk about scale, then you have to talk about how does it fit in the shot, then you have to do that artwork and get it approved, and everything goes through the production and everything goes to the director. So I think memory is that there was a real broad like table setting of things that had been developed to various levels. And I bet there's not one dinosaur mentioned in the book or by Steven that the Winston Studio guys hadn't already, tried to get a handle on.
Cool. Okay. I imagine that makes sense because it's the source material, so it makes sense to kind of start developing it all in case it needs to be used in it and at least start getting a feel for it. So Aaron, who is one of the members of the podcast who tends to go very in depth, so don't worry if you can't answer this one, he actually asked me to ask whether there was a story behind the inclusion of the Parasaurolophus, purely because he noted that it's literally in the lake sequence, and that's the only point it turns up. So he, working in VFX himself, I think he does a lot of 3D animation, was kind of asking if it was something which had to be in, because obviously to model and then rig something for one sequence would have been quite expensive.
So Stephen had gone to Hawaii to scout locations for the shoot, and they were setting up to. They were either just getting started or they had set construction underway. I mean, a lot of what you remember is the things you were working on, and not everybody's stuff. And then there was this big tropical storm, like it was huge, like a hurricane or typhoon, whatever goes to Hawaii. I suppose a hurricane. And it literally knocked down all the trees. And so they couldn't shoot in the locations. But they had taken a lot of photographs of the environment before the big storm. And so Dennis Murin had me come into his office, and he gave me all these photographs and said, as quick as you can you do some sketches of this establishing shot of the Jurassic Park? And we're gonna what the plan was they were gonna actually take those photos and try to use them as source material for a big composite shot. And I don't remember off the top of my head if they were gonna. I'm pretty sure it would have probably included matte painting, but it was probably going to be a way to take advantage of things that Stephen had liked when it was still pre-storm, right?
Yeah.
And then they said, there's a lake, add some, brontosauruses in the water and get some Parasaurolophuses like at the water's edge drinking, because every reference in the movie was naturalistic. So any kind of documentary about Africa or a documentary about a wild environment, they always have footage of watering holes, because that's where animals go. And so the idea was there'll be a big, there's Jurassic Park, and there's a bunch of animals in there by this lake, and there's birds and so on. So I remember looking up the Parasaurolophus just to have a picture in my mind about drawing it. And then I did I swear I did in just an afternoon, I did maybe 5 or 6 studies that were very small, 3 by 4 inches. And then they were copied and blown up slightly, so they were a little bigger. And they didn't have any color, they were black and white. But they got sent down then, and they were approved, and then those became the source. And I don't recall after that ever seeing the Parasaurolophus again, or ever seeing it in a 3D form. It could have been built in a 3D form, but it would have been done in the rigging would have been very simplistic, or it was even maybe a cutout. I mean, it could have just been a shape cutout, because I don't remember them ever being in a storyboard, although they may have been. But and I've seen the other movies, so I kind of, some of it gets a little blurry. But I think that if they built it, it was probably never tricked out like the hero ones.
Yeah, definitely.
And I honestly believe it could have been done with just a cutout, like a 2D cutout, cutout in CG, but something that was just moving on a single axis or something.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense actually, because when you look at it, it's kind of just doing that drinking motion. So I could picture that. Yeah, cool. So I know that obviously before you actually got into your work with ILM, a lot of your background was kind of to do with architectural model building as well, and I found that quite interesting. So I was interested. Obviously, you posted the photo the other day with the model of the Ford Explorer and the T-Rex, which I think everybody in the community was very jealous of. But I'm interested, did you get to apply any of those practical model skills in your role on the film as well?
The short answer would be Not specifically,
Yeah.
no. But one of the things that, and I would say any of your listeners that are interested in working in gaming or in visual effects, anything where you're trying to imitate reality or you're trying to build new worlds, new realities, is to actually learn how to read plans and
Yeah.
get a get enough experience so that when somebody says, well, it's like 10 by 10 feet, that you can pull up a pretty accurate measurement in your mind. Oftentimes, I think young designers they'll become so fascinated with the imagination and the way that anything can happen in the imaginary world that they don't necessarily develop an appreciation for physics, for real physics,
Yeah.
and how things really work. And my period of working as an architectural model builder and then working with architects and learning to read plans is that it did really provide for me a heightened understanding of the difficulties of just stacking stuff of that scale on the earth. Like, because buildings
Yeah.
are like, they have to hold up against gravity and against wind and storms. And so kind of even though I didn't study it, getting a understanding of those realities is super helpful when you come to try to make something from your pure imagination, because the laws of physics, unless it's set on a planet that has no gravity or a space, those things come into play, and you can give credibility and believability to your designs if they seem to have been based on those fundamental, foundational realities that come along with the way that we actually construct things. In the future, those rules may change because we may have new ways of creating large-scale objects. But up until today, there is a certain kind of cadence of shape and, what I refer to often as shape language. And those things you learn if you're focusing on learning them as opposed to just faking them all the time. If you're faking something all the time, you really don't have appreciation for its importance or how it actually the audience reads. I would say the same in a similar vein is study if you're interested in robots or spaceships, study manufacturing, study complex systems, mechanical systems, because again, if you understand those systems and you can employ the language into your imaginary creations, it starts to look more real. People often ask me, because of the work on Avatar, did you study industrial design? But no, I'm just very curious about how machines work, and studying machines can tell you a lot about, makes you go, I know that turns. How does that turn? And then you pick up a better understanding of that. And then the next time you're designing something, you can make it look more authentic.
Yeah. I think that's cool. And just using the Avatar example, it really shows through in the amp suits, especially because I can remember all of the pistons and things that were in the arms. And I still beat myself up to this day that as a kid, I never got any of the toys from the film. So yeah, that's something I'd like to get one day. Cool. So I am interested. Obviously, Jurassic Park, it came out some time ago now, and there's been quite a few sequels since. So have you been keeping track of all the sequels, and what do you think of the effects that they're using in kind of the modern Jurassic World interpretations?
I do see the films. I don't know that I have always gone to the theater to see them. And oftentimes, especially when I was working in film production more, I would go a whole year without, going to the theater just because it takes a lot of time. But I think what I like about it is that they've almost created a new genre of movies. Like when I was a kid, there were, cowboy movies or westerns, there were, monster movies, and there were like, musicals or, dance, musical dance films. And what you find is there's something about those, they become genres, but I would almost call them like subgenres, that they have a lot of room for creative storytelling to take place. And the way I view it is, it's always fine to have a favorite movie of a certain genre. Like for me, I can say hands down, my favorite science fiction movie is 2001: The Space Odyssey. That doesn't mean I don't
choice.
like Aliens. I love Aliens. It doesn't mean I don't like Star Wars, but it does mean that it's okay for me as a consumer to say, I really love this particular film, and for me, it exemplifies what I look for in that particular genre. So that's fine, but I don't feel compelled then either to compare my favorite films to one another. I don't need to say, well, Ridley Scott's Alien was superior to all other monster movies set in space, and here's why. I can like The Predator. I can like, Guardians of the Galaxy. I can like them, and I don't feel compelled to compare them to maybe my favorites, And I guess that's a long way of saying that I think that there's some other films in the franchise that I like better than others. I think sometimes what I believe about the original Jurassic and probably why it holds up and why it's kind of an American classic now that everyone sees is because of the naturalistic aspect. I mean, when Steven was getting going and when we would talk about what the film was going to be like, and I did a lot of work with Dennis Muren and helped him, I was part of a small group that we would get together and screen things and talk about things, is we looked at lots of films and footage of expeditions into Africa when no one really knew where the animals were. I mean, it was like the Hatari, these different things. And what Stephen was saying, at least what I was hearing from Dennis, was that what Jurassic Park was in his mind was a travel film. You're traveling into an uncharted territory to encounter wildlife that lives there that's real. It's not about, on one level, it's not like, holy crap, there's a dinosaur. It's more about, there's dinosaurs here, so be careful. Like it's a pre-given that there's a dinosaur. And I think that except for the rotunda scene, which I've always had, of all of the original film, even though there's some spectacular shots in there, I think that some of the logic of the picture that is pretty well established starts to, it gets a little crazy for me, like why all the dinosaurs are in there and it's waxed floors and the dinosaurs are slitting around and stuff. But by then you're ready to, it's the send off, right? It's like Jurassic Park, the banner falls, yahoo, we're ready to go. So you're already in the moment, your sense of, you're on the ride. You don't care, at that point. But it doesn't, I think by and large, when you see the T-Rex in the Maid Road sequence, what you're really experiencing is the encounter with nature. You're an animal yourself. You're caught in the presence of a huge predator. And the kids in the Jeep, they're like a snack. And and that's what's so interesting is that the Rex is a monster, but the Rex is also eating snacks, and you know that it wants those snacks badly, and so it's not even such a mean. I mean, it's glorious in its prowess and its ability to be a predator. I mean, there's an awe that you have when you see the big mouth and the eyes, and it's a dragon in some way, in a sense that that's the range, that's the kind of archetype that it is. But it's also wanting to eat the tasty children. I want the snacks in the car, and so you can't really be that mad at it. You can be scared of it, but it's not thinking a lot. It's like it's sort of like dealing with nature on its own terms.
Yeah.
And I think some of the later films become much more about spectacle. And like
Yeah.
the end in the Rotunda does, it gets more about spectacle. And that's fine. But I think for me, once it gets really focused on spectacle, then the emotional piece can only be a manufactured thing. You know,
Yeah.
it's like the dinosaurs become antagonists and the characters become protagonists, and they're not tasty treats anymore for the animal that wants to eat them. It's more like they're outwitting the animal that's trying to do the, cleverly, fool them, or, or do something more complex. And I
Yeah.
think that I always think like, well, would it do that? Like, whereas in Jurassic, I go, it would eat those tasty kids. But in some of the other films, I'm like, well, I don't know if it would really care that much to go in there and do that, or,
Yeah.
get inside and do those things. It would probably just run away to the other side of the island and be fine.
Yeah.
But again, like, I don't feel compelled to rank them or, do anything. I do have people, though, and this would be your listeners could know better, that come to me all the time and say, the T-Rex in the main road or in Jurassic 1 is still the best dinosaur ever made. Like,
Yeah.
they just say it's the best. And I find that curious. So the only thing I can think of is it gets back to what I was just describing. It feels real. That for what
Yeah.
whether it's the tasty kids, the rain, the things we've talked about, it's like that's as close to encountering a dinosaur as you're going to get in this lifetime, and it resonates with you. And everything else feels more like a vaudeville show, like a theme park ride, like, you're going into the scary corridor and it's like, oh, where's the thing going to jump out? There it is.
Yeah.
Whereas in Jurassic, it hits a note that people just are captivated by, and I wonder if it's true, because certainly the CGI and the work that's being done in these later films is spectacular. So I can't believe it's technically true, but it could be like the sum of all parts. It's very hard to tease that stuff apart. When the Mona Lisa, you look at it and you go, I don't know, it's just a woman. It's just somebody painted on a board. It's just like a painting. But it captivates you, and then that becomes what it is, and you can't escape it.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because there's so many different layers to the original. I mean, I did a watch party about a month back, and while I was watching it, I kind of had this epiphany where I was like, you can literally watch this film through the eyes of John Hammond, and it's like watching somebody have a dream that they don't want to accept isn't realistic, so they're just constantly trying to achieve it until it eventually all falls apart. So there's like so many different tiers, and I think that's part of the magic of the first film, is the fact that you can still be so deeply immersed by it even today and still find new takeaways from it as well. So I guess when people obviously look at a portfolio like yours, and obviously we've spoke about Jurassic Park, Avatar, Battle Los Angeles, it's all a lot of really, really big, wonderful projects. So if there's somebody who's looking at that and is thinking, wow, where do I get started? This is where you can put obviously your university hat on. What would be like the key piece of advice that you would give somebody?
Well, I have like, like a small batch that I always point students to. Is one of the simplest things that you can do that I think people forget, and it really proved to be super helpful for me, is become an expert at what you love, and look at the things you want to accomplish and think of them as like research assignments. I can't tell you how many young artists and designers approach me and say, can you look at my portfolio, and I really want to work as a character designer for a game company. And I'll say, awesome. And I'll say, what's your favorite game company? And in some cases, they'll say, well, I like lots of games. And I'll go, I know, but you want to work as a game designer in a game company that makes games. Like, who's your favorite game design company? And they go, oh, I really don't know, And that always is a sign to me that they've yet to fully embrace the creation of those future opportunities. They're still living in this kind of like, I feel hungry, I should probably make something to eat. I love pizza, but I don't have any money and I'm not at a store that sells them. So I'll just say, I want pizza. And then you're saying, oh, okay, but how are you going to get that pizza? You know? I mean, so I think it's important to say, if you want to work at EA and you want to design Call of Duty, and that's your bag, that's the thing you want to do, then become expert on, you know, what do they look for in a portfolio at EA? What are the various departments that make up a games company like EA? What's the history of gaming? Who are the top designers? What are their, you know, who did they study? How do they work? And sometimes young artists and designers will say, well, I don't want to copy anybody. I don't want my own creative voice to be manipulated by, other people's, work. I want to keep pure. And actually, it's so unlikely that your particular personal vision will be derailed or malformed by knowing more about the craft. That's not an accurate thing to worry about. You should just study everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, never be afraid to learn what others have learned. I mean, that's the history of humanity, is that we all are standing on the shoulders of giants, you know. So I think being an expert at the things you want to accomplish is something you can do with the internet now, and to an amazing degree. Think of it as research. You know, like if you want to work in the film business, watch movies. And don't just watch movies you like. That's another thing that's really, really problematic, is if you only consume the things you like, you only end up with a very narrow band. And often those directors, like especially somebody like Steven, like they learned from everybody. They learned from John Ford and the Westerns that he shot. They learned from Hitchcock. They learned from, so you don't like build out your understanding of cinema by watching one particular type of film. You build it out by, consuming broadly. And, even if you don't like it, watch it anyway. Like, if you don't like reading subtitles, then, try to find a version that's, that's been, where the voices have been added or whatever. But find a way to look at classic film, study the history. I don't think you have to go back to, you don't have to see the first, other than to know that it exists. You don't have to see the Great Train Robbery, and you don't have to see like the Edison films and stuff like that. But there's no reason not to if you can see them. I mean, but I think starting around for sure by the 1930s, kind of have a sense of what was going on and who was doing what, and then. The two other pieces that I think are really important is time on task is what I refer to it as. So if you want to design characters, design like 500 of them, and then start to think about how you feel about it. Like don't let your work become overly precious, and don't think because you might have done 6 or 8 cool characters that's enough to really work effectively as a professional. People that work for Pixar, Disney, Lucasfilm, who do characters like in a day, they can do a couple dozen character designs. So I think hard work is time on task. Put effort in and do it on a regular basis, and know that you're going to have to do a lot. Like don't think that you're going to just pick it up. It's like it's so funny because it's nobody picks up a guitar and plays Stairway to Heaven. You got to practice, and you got to put in the time, and you have to learn how to play very simple songs, and then build on that repertoire until you can play complex songs. And then eventually, if you start to be a composer, the music in your mind that you're trying to get to your audience will only be technically as advanced as your ability to play it. So it's a self-editing kind of a way. Like if you can't play with a lot of prowess, if you don't have a lot of technical ability to play, then your ability to communicate original melodies is going to be limited by that ability. And the same thing is true in drawing or 3D modeling or whatever. So looking at your development as skill-based development, which is on the exterior of your body, I call it skill acquisition. And then interior development, which is your conceptual understandings of how things operate and the kinds of emotions that come out of your work. Because at the end of the day, narrative work is typically about emotion. This is an evil character, this is a strong character, this is a delicate character. Like, how do you really inject into your designs a sense of who they are? And that comes again with like knowing how things telegraph to the audience, and studying, again, masters, people that have really done it, and then studying nature and studying the world. So be a student of life, be a student of the things you love, and never give up. Like, that's the other thing is, Ron Perlman, the guy who plays Hellboy in the Del Toro's 1 and 2. I got to go to the San Diego Comic-Con with Del Toro and Ron and Mike Mignola and a couple other people in a van, and ended up driving back at night late. And Ron was tired. He was driving. Del Toro was sleeping. And so I was asked to drive. So Ron said he'd stay awake. And, if I drove the last 150 miles or whatever it was up to wherever we were going. And he said something that really affected me. He said, the greatest thing about Hollywood is that there are no losers. There's only quitters. Meaning that you don't, ultimately, Hollywood doesn't say, you can't do what you want, you lose. What happens is you stop trying, you just quit. And then Hollywood moves forward. And, it's your decision. And I always think that when I deal with students that are, coming in as sophomores in college, so I try to be really, especially when they first arrive in the program, super conscientious of where they're at. And some of us, we always need some reinforcement that, the hard work we're putting in is producing good results. And so I'm somebody that really says, no, come on, you can do it. This is great. You're doing great. This is great work. But as a student starts to get into their senior year and they're getting ready to graduate, then the messaging has to switch slightly. And it really has to be about intention, like your ability to say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to work for George Lucas, or I'm going to work at EA, or I'm going to, create my own properties. And then that becomes your focus. And then you create a lifestyle and a practice that supports that. And ultimately, it is your decision. I mean, you will succeed or fail based upon the strategies and the efforts you put into the process. Are there the occasional person that just runs into a streak of bad luck and they're foiled, they're dissuaded, or they're stopped in their tracks? Of course. But that's a minority, I think, if you look at the big picture.
Yeah.
Just like on the other end of the spectrum, do people actually get discovered in Hollywood, sitting on a stool at an ice cream parlor? Like, there's the next Faye Dunaway right there. Like, see if that girl, hire them. They're 15, and then they get a movie deal and they're big stars. Does that happen? Yeah, but rarely.
Yeah.
So, the middle of that bell curve is hard work, attention to detail, strategy, focus, and above all, intention. I will, not
Cool.
I can, or I could. I will.
I like that. I think that's a really nice note to end on as well. So why don't you let people know where they can find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on the tweets at TyRuben, TyRuben. I'm on Facebook at TyRuben Ellingson, I think that's what it is. I'm in the middle of redoing my website because I think it hasn't been touched in 11 years. But that is, I don't know what's up there. It's all pre-digital work, I think. That is alieninsect.com. The word alien, the word insect, put together in one word, .com, alieninsect.com. And you can connect me via email through my website. So.
Yeah. Well, Brad, if you're listening, please make sure all of those are linked in the show notes as well. And on that note, thank you so much for coming on. This has been really, really cool, and I'm glad that we got the time to sit down and do it. It's been really great hearing about, obviously, all your experiences on such a pivotal piece of cinema. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I do enjoy an opportunity to talk about the time I was able to put into the Hollywood film industry and the amazing things that happened along the way. So thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate your listeners taking time to hear what I've had to share.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll enjoy it, and I'm sure they're never going to look at that Gallimimus the same way again as well. Cool. Well, that has been another episode of the Innovation Centre here on the Jurassic Park podcast. I hope you've all enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for more soon.